Good evening, everybody. My name's Debbie Stenberg, and I'm giving you my Share It presentation for Nursing 472. I work in Chester at the Memorial Hospital, and that's where I did my excuse me, presentation. I work in the Oncology Infusion Department, and the topic for my presentation was USP 800, which is otherwise known as United States Pharmacopeal Convention, Chapter 800. I chose this because this is some regulations dealing with the handling of hazardous drugs that are going to go into effect or have to be in place by December 1st, 2019. My audience is my staff. There's about 3 RNs and an LPN and a clerk / nursing assistant. We in our department are required, at our hospital, we're required to have a chemotherapy, biotherapy certificate from the ONS, which is a training oncology nursing society, it's a training, teaches us how to safely administer these drugs, both for the patients and for us, and we're required to have that to administer them. I am oncology certified through the ONCC, so I have a little bit beyond that. But anyway, this is going to come into effect December 1st of this year. So what happened is about the early 80s, a lot of these groups, such as the Oncology Nurse Society, there's a lot of oncology groups and pharmacy groups that deal with hazardous drugs, chemotherapies. They're not all chemotherapies. Sometimes they're used for rheumatoid arthritis and things like that, biological drugs that also have these effects, antivirals. And so there were some guidelines made. They discovered that these drugs were in people's urine, or they were having maybe some reproductive issues. And so they developed guidelines. These guidelines were not enforceable. There wasn't a lot of training. It wasn't standardized that everybody had to have training to handle these drugs, or some places, they just didn't provide the protective equipment. Hazardous drugs are typically drugs that are can cause birth defects, reproductive issues, cancer, alter your genes, those kinds of things. And it are basically some researchers have just said they're drugs that can cause adverse reactions in people when they're handled. So that's what a hazardous drug is. And there's more and more every week. It seems like there's more and more drugs that are released as cancer research, and these other drugs for other diseases are developed, chronic diseases, that there's just more and more of them that are hazardous. Anyway, so then as time went on, these were all updated. OSHA got involved, or OSHA made some guidelines. NIOSH finally issued an alert, I think in 2004, and standards that they, this is what, because people were still, even though these precautions were being taken, people were still, they found, being exposed. And when they cleaned areas where these drugs were administered, there was still a residue of the drug, so people were exposed, still problems, people having effects, still found in the urine. So this went on. Finally, the Joint Commission became involved, and because they're always interested in patient safety more than anything else, but they're becoming supportive of the guidelines. And then this Pharmacopeal Convention is a pharmacy organization that actually deals with regulation of purity of drugs and things like that. And so they had issued, the previous chapter 797, which had to do with the purity of compounding drugs, and then that began to talk about hazardous drugs, compounding hazardous drugs, and from there that kind of evolved into safety for the not only nurses but also pharmacists, people who from the time the drugs are delivered and unpacked to the time that they're compounded in the pharmacy, from the time they're transported from the pharmacy to the unit where they're administered, and then from the time they're cleaned up. And also, one thing I want to tell you too is from a patient who has received these drugs for about 48 hours, give or take, maybe 72 hours, but we say 48 hours, that their body fluids contain these drugs. And so there's precautions that at that time they still need to take those precautions. So this was released in and finalized in 2016. There was some dispute among facilities and oncologists and doctors and healthcare organizations because there's a cost. It was the cost of all these specialized hoods to compound, and the protective equipment, and the training, and the time involved, and it was costly. And so it was revised, and now finally was going to come into effect in December 2019. So I wanted to tell my staff I wanted to introduce them to why this was important, what are hazardous drugs, why it was important, and kind of where we are, how we got to where we are right now, and what's going to happen. And now, in this standard, there's a lot of the guidelines of things that we've always done are going to be the same, but what's different is that this is an enforceable now, that facilities have to do this or they could suffer penalties of some kind from the people that come, like the Joint Commission or whoever does their inspections. They can penalize you, and so it's enforceable and it has to be done. And there is some changes in the personal protective equipment is a little more specific, and the cleaning, training, tracking, documenting all the competencies of the staff and the training that they have trained and have to be trained prior to giving these drugs, and all those kind of things. And surveillance, our health, we have to have annual surveillance from lab work, and questionnaires if we have any problems, and all that stuff has to be documented so that when these people come and look, they can see that we're taking all these steps. So anyway, I wanted to tell my group a little bit about the history and where we came from, where we are, and what's going to happen. So I talked a little bit about and brought some samples and showed them personal protective equipment, and I had some in my PowerPoint presentation, some pictures or some facts. There are gloves, of course. These gloves have to be from the American Society for Testing and Materials. They have to have that stamp on there and a number standard. Gowns have to be plastic coated, and some specifications for them. The respiratory protections if it's needed, if it's a vapor producing drug, or if there's a spill or a big spill and this drug is releasing vapors, the things would have to be worn kind of similar to if a patient, you suspected a patient has TB, it's kind of the same kind of a mask. Face shields if there's going to be spills. We talked a little bit about who was required to wear this personal protective equipment and when. And then we talked a little bit about how it was to be disposed of. And another new thing for us is going to be now we're going to have to use closed system transfer devices, which what that is kind of a specialized lure lock, so that when the IV is connected to the patient's access, whatever they have, just a standard IV connection, if the drug can make vapors or ooze out a little bit of material out of just a regular IV site. So what these do is prevent any vapors from escaping when the connection is made, or just in general, some drugs can vaporize under circumstances. So this is to protect so that no drug is supposed to be able to get out. And so we talked about that, and selections of those, and a lot of these devices are based on what works with equipment you already have, and things like that. So it's not all that you have to use this one certain thing, but you have the opportunity to select what works best for your department. And so, but they have to be suitable to do this job. Another thing is spills. Spills have to be cleaned appropriately. For a long time, 2 or 3 or 4 years now, we've had to have annual, or not annual, but quarterly spill drills, and there's a certain procedure to clean up these hazardous drugs. People have to wear, like they were going to administer the drugs, the gowns and the mask, and the eyewear, boots on your feet, and there's a specific way you clean it up. And so but now they're really stressing that after you clean it up, that the drug residue is still there, so you have to neutralize it with a bleach solution, and then some other chemical that goes to neutralize the bleach, and then they determine that area is free of drug. So those kinds of things will have to be learned and practiced. We have to have drills, and we talked about those things. Then we talked about the compliance of that we will have to have new policies and procedures in place that are clear. People will have to competencies, and people will have to review these policies, and that will have to be documented, that all those trainings and reviewing of all this, and that people are demonstrating that they know how to do these things. That all has to be documented. So those are some new practices. Not that we weren't doing it, but it has to be observed and documented. So those are some new things for us. So I told them all about that. And another interesting thing about this USP 800 is that this is some standards and regulations that are going to be, for the first time, a pharmacy organization is going to have a say in nursing practice, and some regulation on actual nursing practice, which is different, because always before it was from nursing to nursing. So that's a little bit different. This is also regulations and standards that is going to depend a lot on departments working together. Housekeeping, pharmacy, we're all going to have to be trained and work together to make all these things work and to keep everybody safe from when they're handling these drugs. And we'll have to be, primarily we will be doing the training of other departments such as housekeeping, and on the nursing floor, if they would have a patient that would be receiving a hazardous drug, we would be doing the education. So I wanted to prepare my staff and get a little idea, so that when all this stuff starts to fall into place in the next few months, that's why and how come, and the importance of that. So we talked about that. I can't think of anything else about my presentation to tell you. I'm going to attach my PowerPoint so you can look at that. I think I don't like to talk like this. It makes me nervous, and it's hard for me to get the words out sometimes. But this went a little better than my previous presentation for our other class that we had to do, just because I'm familiar with these things, and it was easier with my group. I learned a lot through this process, because I learned a lot about this regulation that we're going to have to work with, and had learned kind of how to put this together myself with the help of my preceptor. My preceptor was the CNO of our hospital, and she helped me a little bit with, we talked about it. and kind of planned about it. If I did the presentation again, I would try to be a little more organized and get things together earlier so that it could be not just rushed and hurried up and squeeze it in. And I would like to have it in a small hospital, and we don't have very many staffs. It's hard to get an audience. It would have been nice to have had a bigger group, but that wasn't possible. This class was kind of a good practice for how to organize time and get all these things lined out and done and carried out, planned and followed through with and carried out. So that was good. It was also good to spend a lot of time with my preceptor. She was good to explain a lot of things. It was also good to see a lot of things that all through our classes that we've talked about different things, to actually see these programs and policies in effect, because in our own hospital, because a lot of times just as a nurse working on the floor, you don't see or know that all these things are going on. So it was interesting to see them in action and to see how they affected us at our hospital. And I think it's made this class in general has made me more aware of trying to be a better leader and example, and working collaboration and working with others, working with my staff to try to make things the best that they can be for the patients. And I think that's it. So I'm going to attach my PowerPoint so you can look at that. And congratulations, everybody. We're almost done. A couple more days. And hope everybody has a nice summer and much success in their careers. And thank you very much.